The emergency room doors slammed against the walls. Bruce Lee burst through with his son collapsed in his arms. Brandon's chest heaved, fighting for air that wouldn't come. The sound that escaped the boy's throat, metallic, grinding like crushed steel, dragged across concrete, cut through the waiting room. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold, clinical. Bruce's shoes squeaked against linoleum as he moved, fast, controlled, but his hands trembled beneath the weight of Brandon's limp body. The child's head lolled back. Small fingers clutched at nothing. Blue, the boy's lips were turning blue. Bruce's eyes swept the room. Worn vinyl chairs lined the walls. A man cradled a bloody hand wrapped in a dish towel. An elderly woman slumped against her daughter's shoulder. And there, behind a formica counter littered with paperwork and styrofoam coffee cups, sat a woman in nurse's scrubs. She didn't look up. Bruce crossed the distance in 4 strides. Brandon wheezed again, worse now, that terrible crushing metal sound filling his tiny lungs, or failing to fill them. Bruce reached the counter. "My son," he said. His voice came out steady despite everything. "He can't breathe." The nurse's pen continued scratching across forms. What happened next would determine if Brandon Lee saw morning. "My son can't breathe." Bruce's voice cut through the sterile air. Brandon convulsed against his chest, each wheeze sharper than the last. Margaret's pen continued scratching across the intake form. She didn't look up. Her voice emerged flat as the formica counter between them. "We're at capacity. You'll have to wait." The words landed like stones. Bruce shifted Brandon's weight, feeling the child's ribs strain beneath his palm. The desperate expansion of lungs that found no air. "Please," Margaret finally raised her eyes, not to Bruce's face, not to the blue-tinged lips of the dying child. Her gaze swept past them both, landing somewhere over Bruce's shoulder. Her hand extended toward the crowded waiting room, a gesture as mechanical as her tone. "Take a seat. Someone will call you." The pen resumed its rhythm. Paper rustled. A phone rang at the far end of the desk. Margaret reached for it without hesitation, turning her back completely. Few could understand what Bruce felt in that moment, the collision of disbelief and recognition. He knew this wall. He'd met it 1,000 times before. But Brandon had never needed to. Behind him, the emergency room doors burst open again. Bruce turned. A white woman rushed in, carrying a boy roughly Brandon's age. The child was crying, vocal, pink-cheeked and breathing just fine. 3 minutes passed like drowning. Brandon's wheeze thinned to a whistle, then barely a thread of sound. His small chest collapsed inward with each failed breath, ribs retracting beneath skin that had gone from pale to gray. Bruce shifted his son's weight, feeling the fever radiating through thin cotton pajamas. The entrance doors swung open. A white woman entered, her daughter perhaps 5 years old, crying loudly but walking on her own. The child's cheeks were flushed pink, healthy pink. Margaret glanced up. Her pen moved immediately. "Room 3, she said, waving them past the counter. The woman nodded and disappeared through the treatment area doors. They closed with a soft click. Few could understand what happens to a man's body when he watches his dying child denied while another walks through. Bruce's molars ground together. His pulse hammered against his throat. He stood, cradling Brandon against his chest, and walked back to the desk. "That family arrived after us." Margaret's eyes flicked up, then away. Her mouth flattened into a bloodless line. "Don't start." 2 words, a warning, a command. But Brandon's breathing was fading, and Bruce realized Margaret had no intention of ever calling them back. Brandon's whimper sliced through the fluorescent hum, a wet, rattling sound like crumpled foil scraping bone. His small fingers clawed at his throat, digging into the skin as if he could tear open an airway that wouldn't yield. Bruce dropped to his knees, cradling the burning fever heat of his son's body. Sweat soaked through Brandon's shirt, drenching Bruce's hands. The boy's lips had darkened past blue, purple now, bruised twilight. Bruce smoothed the damp hair plastered to Brandon's forehead. His touch stayed gentle even as his pulse hammered against his ribs. Every second stretched, thinned, became unbearable. He could smell it now, the sharp antiseptic of the hospital mixing with the salt of his own fear. He knew 17 ways to fracture Margaret's wrist from this distance, 23 if he vaulted the counter. Violence lived in his muscles like coiled wire, ready, waiting, but the cameras overhead blinked red. Security would come, police would follow, and Brandon would die while his father sat in handcuffs, labeled a threat. But silence was surrender. Silence was watching his child suffocate on institutional indifference. The choice crystallized, not in his fists, but in something sharper. Bruce rose slowly, his gaze locking on the reception desk. What he carried toward Margaret now wasn't rage, it was weaponized truth. Bruce lowered Brandon onto a plastic waiting room chair. The boy's wheezing filled the space between them. He brushed sweat-dampened hair from his son's forehead, then turned. His footsteps made no sound against the linoleum. At the reception desk, he placed both palms flat on the Formica counter. The surface was cold, solid. Margaret glanced up, irritation already forming on her lips. Bruce leaned forward. His voice dropped to a whisper, low enough that she had to stop breathing to hear it. "If my son dies while we wait, every newspaper in California will know this hospital refused a Chinese child." The words hung in the fluorescent glare. Not a threat, a promise. Margaret's pen froze mid-stroke, her face drained 2 shades paler. Around them, other families had stopped their restless shifting. A man lowered his magazine. A mother clutched her daughter closer. The clock on the wall ticked. Once, twice, Brandon gasped behind them, a wet, rattling sound that clawed at the silence. Bruce didn't move. His palms remained pressed to the counter. His eyes held Margaret's without blinking. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then her hand reached for the phone, trembling as it lifted the receiver. But what happened next would determine if truth was enough to break institutional stone. The waiting room held its breath. Margaret's pen stopped mid-stroke, suspended above the form she'd been scratching through. Her knuckles whitened around the plastic barrel. Bruce's palms remained flat on the Formica counter, steady, unmoving. He didn't blink, didn't breathe louder than necessary. Every eye in the waiting room fixed on the reception desk. The wall clock ticked, once, twice. Brandon gasped, a wet, strangled sound that clawed through the silence. His small chest jerked with the effort. Bruce's jaw tightened, but his hands stayed planted. He'd thrown the dice. Now gravity would decide. Margaret's face had gone the color of old milk. Her mouth opened, closed. The phone receiver sat inches from her trembling fingers. Someone coughed in the corner. A child whimpered. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in surgical brightness. Time stretched thin as surgical thread, taut, ready to snap. Then footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp, purposeful, growing louder. Bruce's shoulders tensed. Margaret's eyes darted toward the sound. The footsteps rounded the corner, leather soles striking linoleum with authority, and whoever was coming would decide if Brandon lived or died in the next 60 seconds. The man in the white coat stopped mid-stride. His eyes locked on Brandon, on the child's chest caving between his ribs with each desperate pull for air. On the skin turned the gray-blue of winter rain. "Bring him back now." Margaret's hand jerked toward the clipboard. "Doctor, the cue, that child is in respiratory distress." Dr. Whitfield's voice cut like steel. "Move." Bruce lifted Brandon before the sentence finished. The hallway stretched endless. Treatment room, examination table. The doctor's hands moved with rehearsed precision, twisting valves, positioning the mask. Cool mist hissed from the nebulizer, carrying epinephrine into Brandon's collapsing airways. 10 seconds, 20. Bruce's fingers dug into his own palms hard enough to draw blood. He couldn't blink, couldn't breathe. The universe had contracted to the rise and fall of his son's chest. Then, a deeper inhale. The stridor softened. Brandon's shoulders dropped as oxygen finally reached his lungs. Pink bloomed at the edges of his lips like dawn breaking. Bruce's knees buckled. He caught himself against the wall. Dr. Whitfield didn't look up from adjusting the flow rate. Another 20 minutes. He let the words hang, unfinished. But what haunted Bruce wasn't what might have happened. It was realizing how many others had no voice loud enough to shatter that waiting room silence. Dr. Whitfield lowered the nebulizer mask, studied Brandon's chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Color had returned to the boy's face, pink blooming where blue had reigned. He turned to Bruce. "Another 20 minutes and this could have been critical. You did the right thing." Bruce stood beside the examination table, hands still trembling against the cold metal rail. His knuckles were white. The adrenaline that had fueled his confrontation now drained away, leaving only the raw truth behind. "I shouldn't have had to fight to save my child's life." The words fell quiet between them. No accusation, no anger. Just fact stripped to bone. Dr. Whitfield opened his mouth, closed it. His stethoscope hung heavy around his neck, suddenly weightless against the statement. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped, footsteps passed the door. The fluorescent lights buzzed their eternal hum. He had no answer. Truth had already struck deeper than any fist could reach. Bruce lifted Brandon gently into his arms. The boy stirred, murmured something incoherent. His small hand curled against his father's chest. But what would break inside Bruce when he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had almost been lost? That reckoning waited just beyond the edge of dawn. Dawn light crept through the examination room window, gold spilling across sterile white walls. Brandon slept in Bruce's arms, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. No wheeze, no rattle, just the soft whisper of air moving freely through healed passages. Bruce sat motionless, his son's weight pressed against him, warm and alive. The boy's hair still damp with sweat, his small fingers curled loosely against Bruce's shirt. Then something broke. A tear slid down Bruce's cheek. Another followed. Silent, unstoppable, his jaw trembled. The hands that could shatter wood, that moved faster than cameras could capture, now cradled 4 years of fragile life with infinite gentleness. He bent his head, pressing his lips to Brandon's forehead. Breathing in the scent of his child, alive, still here. In this moment, no one would recognize the warrior, just a father who had faced an enemy he couldn't fight with fists. A system designed to make him beg, to make him prove his son's humanity was worth the trouble. He had won, Brandon breathed, but something darker stirred beneath the relief, a question that wouldn't fade with morning light. How many other fathers had lost this battle before dawn could save them? 3 weeks passed. The administrative office at Oakland Community Hospital smelled of burnt coffee and mimeograph ink. Dr. Whitfield stood before a room packed with nurses and residents, holding a single-page document. The new triage protocol. His fingers traced the revised emergency assessment guidelines, criteria stripped of subjective judgment. That father used truth and consequence as his weapon, he said, his voice carrying the weight of confession. And it changed how we treat every patient. Margaret sat in the back row. She didn't meet anyone's eyes. The policy mandated immediate respiratory distress evaluation, regardless of surname, regardless of skin. Clinical indicators only, observable symptoms, measurable distress. Few in that room understood the protocol's true origin, the blueprint born from a father's desperation, a whispered threat that exposed the fault lines in their system. But across California, other hospitals began adopting similar standards. The ripples moved outward, invisible, relentless. Brandon Lee grew strong, his lungs clear, his laughter filling rooms his father had once fought to enter. He would live to become a man. And though the world would remember Bruce Lee for his fists and philosophy, this victory required neither. Only truth, only love, only the refusal to accept his child's erasure. The weapon that changed everything was witness.